Psalm 90 is where we will be here in just a moment. I appreciate Drew leading us in those two songs and the prayer that our brother Kevin led us in as well. To think, especially today, I'm sure all of us driving in this morning were just enveloped by all the fog. Those of us that were coming from north of the river, driving across the 430 bridge there, that's all you could see. And mornings like this, there is something when it's, at least in my mind, when it's cloudy, foggy, early in the morning, just a peace to the world and a reminder that our God, this is our Father's world as we've sung this morning, that He has created all of this for our enjoyment. And it certainly is good for us to have reminders like that every day of our life. And in some ways, that's going to tie into what we're going to think about this morning as we read and consider Psalm 90. So if you're there, let's begin reading and read the entire psalm this morning. Psalm 90 and verse 1, the psalmist says, "Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you gave birth to the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You turn man back into dust and say, 'Return, O children of men.' For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it passes by, or as a watch in the night. You have swept them away like a flood, they fall asleep. In the morning they are like grass which sprouts anew. In the morning it flourishes and sprouts anew. Toward evening it fades and withers away. For we have been consumed by your anger, and by your wrath we have been dismayed. You have placed our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. For all our days have declined in your fury. We have finished our years like a sigh. As for the days of our life, they contain 70 years, or if due to strength, 80 years, yet their pride is but labor and sorrow, for soon it is gone, and we fly away. Who understands the power of your anger and your fury according to the fear that is due you? So teach us to number our days, that we may present to you a heart of wisdom. Do return, O Lord, how long will it be? And be sorry for your servants. O satisfy us in the morning with your loving kindness, that we may sing for joy and be glad all our days. Make us glad according to the days you have afflicted us, and the years we have seen evil. Let your works appear to your servants, and your majesty to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and confirm for us the work of our hands. Yes, confirm the work of our hands." There is some debate among scholars as to who wrote Psalm 90. But most of them, at least in my study and putting this lesson together, agree that it was Moses. And if you have a Bible that gives perhaps the author of each of the Psalms and maybe gives a description of or an inscription rather of the Psalm, you can see that it is Moses, I think, in most translations. It is, at least in the New American Standard, says a prayer of Moses, the man of God. He was certainly a man of God. We remember him as being the lawgiver. We remember him as one who walked very closely with God. We remember him, as the Bible describes for us, as being the meekest man that walked on the face of the earth. He had a strong, close relationship with God. I don't know exactly when Psalm 90 was written. Some people think that it was written maybe toward the end of Moses' life. Perhaps you might think about toward the end of the book of Deuteronomy. We have the song of Moses, we have the blessing of Moses, and then God takes him up on the mountain, and he is not able, of course, to go into the land of Canaan, but he sees the land of Canaan, and then he dies. And if that is the case, then that helps me to kind of put Psalm 90 into that context. One writer said that Psalm 90 is probably the oldest of all the Psalms. It was written by Moses, no doubt, during the wilderness wandering. And if that be the case, I think it's there toward the very end of that time. You can think about all that Moses has experienced in his life up until this point. You can think about all the frustrations that he has had with God's people. how he, just like God himself, from time to time wanted to just do away with the people of Israel and start over. But Moses was certainly, again, a great man of God. And as we look here at Psalm 90, I want us to focus on this phrase that is found here in description of our great God at the end of verse 2, where Moses reminds us that even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. So I want us to think about this psalm with those words in mind. First of all, as we look at verses 1 and 2, Moses describes for us here the nature of God, that God is an eternal being. Let's read those two verses again. He says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations before the mountains were born, or you gave birth to the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Moses begins this psalm by addressing God as Lord, that He is the ruler, He is the master of all. He is Lord of heaven and earth, as Paul would say in the book of Acts chapter 17, where he's there, you might remember, in the city of Athens, and he's trying to describe to a people about Jehovah God, who He is, that He does exist, and that He is the creator of all, and He's the one who sustains everything. But he begins the psalm by addressing God as Lord. He begins by describing God as Israel's dwelling place. This is a term, according to one writer, that suggests an exclusive place not available to all. That Israel was, that God was Israel's dwelling place. He says that you have been our dwelling place in all generations. This wasn't something that was just available to everyone, because Israel was God's chosen, holy, unique people. At this particular point in time, of course, Israel had not had a place to rest. If Psalm 90 was written toward the end of the wandering in the wilderness period, they had not really had a place to call home for at least coming up on 40 years at this particular point. And yet I think Moses is reminding himself and reminding God's people that even though they've been wandering around in this desert, in this wilderness for a number of years now, that God really was their dwelling place, that God was their place of rest, that God was their place of refuge. And he says in all generations, to me this speaks to this particular point that he's trying to begin this psalm with, that God is eternal in nature. That God doesn't have a beginning, God doesn't have an ending, that God has always been their God. And He has always been a place of refuge and rest and strength for His people throughout time. One writer said here that God is seen here as our God, whose eternity is the answer, not the antithesis, to our homelessness and our brevity of life. Because we're going to see here, as we've already read this morning, the psalmist not only talks to us about the eternal nature of God, that God is from everlasting to everlasting, but we are in contrast to that. That our life here upon earth is very brief. It's very short. We have a beginning and we have an end as far as this world goes. And so God is the answer. God, our eternal God, our everlasting God, is the answer to even today our sense of homelessness and knowing just how short life really is. Well, as Moses continues contemplating God's eternal nature, he then writes that before God, notice the language that he uses here in verse 2, before the mountains were born, before He gave birth to the earth and the world. So even before God gave birth, if you will, to the creation, that God existed. God is eternal, and that God will continue to exist even after this present world is no more. Thinking about that kind of imagery, that kind of terminology about God giving birth to the earth, and then there will come a time when this present earth will die and we'll have something new that God has created for us. He's saying God is beyond all that. God spans all of that amount of time and even beyond both ways. So although we can't fully comprehend it, I think from an intellectual standpoint, we can understand eternity, everlasting. But from an experiential standpoint, none of us have experienced that. Everything that we do every day, even right now, I'm just looking at the clock and thinking I've only got a certain amount of time left to present this lesson. I mean, everything that we do, when we wake up in the morning, we look at our clocks, we look at our phones. Everything that we do is bound by time and by space, but God is not. And so, although it is very hard for us to fully wrap our arms around this, truly Jehovah is from everlasting to everlasting. We might say that God, our great God that we've already sung about this morning, He is from eternity to eternity. So, having talked to us about the eternal nature of God, then the psalmist talks to us about the mortal nature of man. Verse 3 again, he says, "You turn man back into dust and say, 'Return, O children of men, for 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it passes by, or as a watch in the night. You have swept them away like a flood, they fall asleep. In the morning they are like grass which sprouts anew. In the morning it flourishes and sprouts anew. Toward evening it fades and withers away. It fades and withers away.'" We'll stop right there at verse 6. He reminds us, Moses does, there at verse 3, that soon us as human beings, as mankind, that God will turn us back into dust. I think this is one of the consequences of sin entering the world. Certainly, there was a spiritual death that took place, that we were separated from God because of our sins. But also, we die physically. We experience physical death. And because we sinned against the one who formed us as people from the dust of the ground, the one whom the Genesis writer Moses himself says there in chapter 2, that God breathed the breath of life into us and man became a living being, that body is going to return to dust one day. Just as surely as God spoke mankind into existence, He's going to speak and say to us at some point in each of our lives and our earthly existence, "Return, O children of men," and all of us, unless the Lord returns first, will experience death. And since that is true, something that is common to all of us, as Solomon would remind us in the book of Ecclesiastes, since it's only a matter of time that all of us will experience death, all of us, at least our physical bodies, will turn back into dust, we all need to take advantage of the time that we have right now. The time that God has given us today on this Sunday morning in December of 2024, that we can return to Him. If we see that we have separated ourselves from God, if we see that there is some distance between us and God because of our sins, because of the wrong choices that we have made in our life, we have a perfect opportunity right now to turn back to God, to return to Him. Again, Moses reminds us, even in this section talking to us about how we as people are temporary, that God is not. He says 1,000 years for Him is just like yesterday for us. Do you remember what you did yesterday? Maybe some of us do, maybe some of us don't. Do you remember what you ate? Do you remember what you said yesterday? Do you remember the thoughts that crossed your mind yesterday? He said, just like we think about yesterday, that wasn't maybe very long ago, or maybe it seems like a long time for us. It doesn't really matter that God doesn't view time in the same way that we do. And I think Moses really drives that particular point home here by using some illustrations that the Jews would be very familiar with. Again, if Psalm 90 was written toward the end of the wilderness wandering period, after almost 40 years of being nomads here in a deserted place. He talks here about a watch in the night. He talks here about being swept away like a flood. He reminds them of the grass that comes up in the morning, that flourishes and sprouts, and then toward evening it fades and withers away. Just think about those illustrations in light or in view of the children of Israel being here in the wilderness for a number of years. They could see, I'm sure, on many occasions the desert rains coming up and just bringing flash floods, but then quickly subsiding. They might have seen the grass what little grass there might have been, flourishing while it was wet with dew, but just quickly wilting after being under the scorching sun there, out in the wilderness in a deserted place, and soaking up a full day's scorching rays from the sun. So I think perhaps the pictures that Moses is painting here would have meant a lot more to them, perhaps, than it does to us. But whatever these pictures mean, one truth is very certain here from the psalmist Moses, that he's reminding himself and reminding Israel and reminding us today that God is behind all of this, as we've already sung about today. That God is the one who is driving all this. God is the power. He is the force behind all of this. That He can sweep away even 1,000 years of our history just like that. In a moment of time, all of that could be gone. And I think that truth about who God is and about who we are, it ought to give all of us pause. It ought to make us mindful of just how fragile our life here on earth really is, but it also ought to turn our attention to Him and our focus to Him to see just how great our need for God is, because we are finite and God is infinite. Then Moses focuses here once again on God, and he talks to us about two characteristics of God, about His omnipotence, His great limitless power, and His omniscience, His all-knowing nature. Look here at verses 7 through 9 and then verse 11. He says again, "For we have been consumed by your anger, and by your wrath we have been dismayed. You have placed our iniquities before you, our secret sins, in the light of your presence. For all our days have declined in your fury. We have finished our years like a sigh." Verse 11, "Who understands the power of your anger and your fury, according to the fear that is due you?" In the time that Moses had led the children of Israel through the wilderness, they had seen the awesome, mighty power of God, hadn't they? Even just coming out of Egypt, even before they left Egypt, they saw the awesome power that God had at His disposal in bringing those 10 plagues against the land of Egypt. Those plagues were obviously to impress God's people, the Israelites. More than that, though, they were to impress Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And of course, people in other nations were talking about those great wonders of God long after those things had occurred. But Israel had seen just so many displays of God's power. They had seen God protect them time and time again. They had also seen, maybe from a negative side, how God was correcting them and disciplining them and using His power in that way. But they had seen all of that fully on display. They had seen, in the words of the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans, I think it's chapter 11, they had seen the goodness and the severity of God. They had seen the totality of who God is. And here Moses, in these few verses, I think is thinking about the latter. He's thinking about corrective, punitive discipline for the people. He's thinking maybe about the severity of God. For nearly 40 years, Israel had suffered the consequences of their choice, which was an ongoing choice, I think, to really not trust in God, to not obey God, rather to trust in themselves or to trust in the peoples of the lands around them, to trust in the gods of the peoples living around them. But their choice so many times to not trust that God would do what He said He would do, that He would keep His promises, that He would allow them or empower them, if you will, to drive out the inhabitants of the land of Canaan, to give them the land as He had promised. And because they had chosen not to trust God, they suffered the consequences time and time again. But they also suffered even from the very beginning. I think it was just 3 days after they had come out of Egypt, back in the book of Exodus, that they're complaining. They are longing to go back. And all of that, the consequences of their distrust of God, their constant complaining, their rebellion against the one who had delivered them from Egyptian bondage. In short, by this time, Israel had experienced God's anger and God's wrath many times over. But God, like a good father does, He knew His people, He knew His children, inside and out. To the point that He even saw who they really were. As Moses says there at verse 8, that our secret sins are in the light of your presence, that God had brought those things to light, that God could see those things that maybe they were trying to cover up, those things that they were trying to hide, because He is not only an omnipotent God, but He is an omniscient God. We learn from Scripture, not just from the example of the children of Israel. We learn from the example of David. We learn from the example of Achan. We learn from lots of examples in Scripture that if we tried to hide sin from this God who is all-powerful and all-knowing, we're not going to go out with a bang. We're not going to go out with fireworks going off and there's a celebration of our life. Rather, our days will decline, as Moses reminds us in these few verses. They will decline in God's fury. They will end, he says, not with a shout of celebration. He says they will end like a sigh. I'm sure all of us have sighed at some point, haven't we? Maybe when we're tired, we're just worn out with life. Maybe when we're frustrated with someone, we just let out a big sigh. And Moses says, if we do not trust God, if we do not follow God, if we do not obey God, our years here on earth are going to end like a sigh. And so let us come to learn what Moses learned, that our great God is an all-powerful, He is an all-knowing being. And if we will learn that, we can live out our days with meaning. And we can live out our days here on earth with purpose. Once again, there's kind of this back and forth here, I think, in Psalm 90 as he talks to us about God, but then talks to us about ourselves. He once again reminds us that we are finite beings as far as this earthly world goes. Look here at verse 10 and verse 12. As for the days of our life, they contain 70 years, or if due to strength, 80 years. Yet their pride is but labor and sorrow, for soon it is gone and we fly away. So teach us to number our days, that we may present to you a heart of wisdom. Here's the sad reality of living in this world of sin. It doesn't matter how much we take care of our bodies. And I believe it is a good thing for us as much as possible to take care of our bodies. They are from God. They are God's creation. They are a reflection, I think, in some way of who our great God is. But no matter how much we take care of our bodies and our minds, whether we get on a very strict diet, I'm sure anyone here this morning who's thinking about dieting is going to do that January 2nd, right? We've got to enjoy all the food that's going to be available here in the next few weeks. But it doesn't matter if we say, okay, come January 2nd of next year, I'm going to really buckle down and get on a strict diet. It doesn't matter whether you go to the doctor for regular checkups. I've unfortunately got my yearly checkup Tuesday. It doesn't matter whether we get up every morning and we devote ourselves for a time to rigorous exercise. It doesn't matter whether we are staying sharp mentally and sharpening our mental skills. The truth is that sooner or later, all of us are going to experience death. We are all going to reach the end of our time here on earth. And even those of you in the audience this morning that may be younger in age, you're thinking, yeah, I know that in the back of my mind, but that seems like so long off. That's such a far ways down the road. But I'm here to tell you, and even people who are older than I here this morning will tell you it happens more quickly than you think. And Moses reminds us of that here in this section. He says about our life, for soon it is gone, and we fly away. And so while there's nothing that any of us can do to avoid death, we can do something to make the most of the time, the finite days that God has blessed us here in this earth. We can learn from the one who is, as Moses is trying to remind us in this psalm, we can learn from the one who is from everlasting to everlasting. We can learn from him. We can learn from Moses. We can learn from other faithful people of God to number our days. I don't believe that's the idea of saying, well, okay, I've got, this is day number, whatever it is, 2,346 in my life. He's saying, it's kind of the same idea I think that Paul writes about in Ephesians chapter 5 about walking wisely and making the most of the time, the opportunities that God has given to us here. Moses is trying to remind us that we need to number our days, that we need to be people who are living with a heart of wisdom so that every day, every moment of our life counts. So when we come to know truly the brevity of life and we trust God with every breath that we take, I think we will be able to number our days. We will be able to live in a way that pleases God. We will be able to, at the end of our life, present our Maker a heart of wisdom. And we will be truly blessed when that happens. Finally, Moses says to us here in this closing section of the psalm that we truly need God. He says, "Do return, O Lord, how long will it be? And be sorry for your servants. So satisfy us in the morning with your loving kindness, that we may sing for joy and be glad all our days. Make us glad according to the days you have afflicted us and the years we have seen evil. Let your work appear to your servants and your majesty to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us and confirm for us the work of our hands. Yes, confirm the work of our hands. Again, think about this as from Israel's standpoint and where Israel is perhaps in their history right now. They are toward the end of a 4-decade-long wandering through the wilderness. And God's discipline of His people had lasted long enough, and now Moses, perhaps before he's about to die, maybe he is asking God to have a change of heart, a change of attitude, if you will, toward His chosen people. He knows, Moses certainly does, after leading God's people for so many years, he knows that they desperately need God. God doesn't so much need them. God is still God, whether they're His people or not. But He knows that they desperately need God. They desperately need this being, this one who is from everlasting to everlasting. And so as he is pleading with God on behalf of His people, Moses is requesting that Jehovah God would show His favor on them. He would show that abundantly to them. He would delight in them to the same extent that He had brought affliction upon them from time to time. And so here in this closing section, Moses, it seems to me, is urging or begging the God who is from everlasting to everlasting, the all-knowing, all-powerful God, to just shower His servants with all of His attributes, His loving kindness, joy, gladness, and delight. Moses, again, of all people, knows who this people is, that they often are a stubborn, rebellious, obstinate people. He knows they don't deserve it. But anyway, he asks for it. And he ends this psalm by asking God here at verse 17 to confirm, to give credence or permanence to the work of our hands. Psalm 90 is just a beautiful psalm. It reminds us to focus on God. Even especially in this time of year where we're so busy focusing on so many things, good things, that our mind really is not on God as it should be. Maybe we drove in this morning looking at all the fog and we thought, well, this is not going to be a good day. But it should have reminded us of who God is. That our God is above, outside the fog. He is above the clouds. He is the God who is from everlasting to everlasting. And as this man of God, Moses, came to the end of his life, he wanted to know, I think what all of us want to know, that our 70 or 80 or 90 years here on earth were not in vain. That despite all of our sins and all of our shortcomings, that we have made a difference in this world to the point that our children, if we have children, can see God's work and see God's majesty all around us. And they can see that hopefully in us. That will begin with us. That we will be teaching the world around us that we serve not only an awesome God, but we serve a God who is from everlasting to everlasting. I hope this sermon from Psalm 90 this morning has not been depressing. It does talk to us about death. I don't believe it was the intention of Moses for this psalm to be depressing. I think this ought to be a joyful psalm. This ought to be something that lifts our hearts. And so yes, although our time on earth is but for a moment, we always need to remember whatever is going on in our life, that our good and great God is from everlasting to everlasting. As we close this morning and are about to go to our classes, just to leave this question with you, do you know the eternal God? Do you really know Him? As much as possible for us to know God in this earthly existence, do you really know Him? Do you just know some things about Him? Some facts, some information about Him? Or do you really know who He is? Are you growing in a relationship with Him? Because He wants to know you. He does know you. But He wants to know you intimately. And He wants you to know Him intimately as well. So with those thoughts in mind, let's be dismissed to our classes.